So politics in Europe and America has been very focused on international trade. So as you know, Donald Trump ran on an anti-trade platform, and Biden's mostly carried a lot of that on. Brexit in the UK is a very anti-trade movement. So it's important to think about what are the impacts on work from home, on globalization, on competition from overseas. So here I think it's important, again, to break out into two groups. There's hybrid, so professionals, managers, probably most people listening. For those folks, me, for example, I go into the office 2-3 days a week. It's not really possible that someone living in Bulgaria, in the Philippines, in Nigeria, in Colombia could easily do that job. They couldn't come to Stanford campus 2-3 days a week. So for hybrid workers who are most professionals and managers, I don't think currently there's much of a threat of overseas competition. In fact, I should change the word. I shouldn't really use the word threat. You could also think about it as an opportunity to access global labor markets. For fully remote workers, that's definitely a huge issue. So if you're the type of person that's fully remote, they tend to be payroll processing, IT support, benefits, some finance jobs, some coders. If these can be done fully remotely, they can mostly be done anywhere. There are some barriers around tax and regulation, etc., but secure data. But often these jobs can and will be performed anywhere around the world. And in fact, when I talk to companies and organizations, they say this is a huge opportunity. This is an amazing way. I talk to a lot of companies out in Silicon Valley, and they say it's incredibly expensive to hire people locally. I can now hire people across America and in fact around the world. And I was talking to a CEO the other day, and he was saying they've opened big hiring centers now. I mean, he literally said Bulgaria and Nigeria, the two places he's hired a lot of people. Now, I think that's good globally. I think it's good in terms of providing increased labor supply. For Europe and the US, we have issues with aging workforce, with not enough workers. It's why inflation is very high. There's not enough workers and wages are going up. So if we can bring in some, talented workers from around the world, that's going to help. It does mean that the future path of globalization is changing. So globalization from 2000 to 2019 was mainly around manufacturing trade. So a big rise of China, big rise of Southeast Asia, and less manufacturing employment in Europe and the US. 2023 onwards, I think it's going to be much more around services. So manufacturing globalization is kind of stalling, but it's going to be around services, and it's very much remote jobs. So there'll be a huge rise of people working in emerging middle income, even developing countries, who can work fully remotely. I mean, anyone that's rung up a call center has already experienced this. Or if you have a problem, IT support, or you try and book something, or you work with one of those humans behind the chatbots. Mostly they're not in Europe and the US, mostly in developing countries, and that kind of thing's going to grow. And it's both a threat and an opportunity. It's a threat for companies. It's a threat for some individuals, but I think in the bigger picture, it's an opportunity for companies and economies to grow. So remote work has changed labor markets over the last 3 years since the beginning of the pandemic in a really amazing way. So in fact, I just taught my Stanford PhD students this, and I'm going to tell another group of Stanford undergrads this, how incredible this has been. So I'm going to take you back to set the scene, to tell the story, which is, if you look in America and Europe, inequality since the 1980s has been rising and rising and rising. So inequality in America, for example, went up from 1980 to 2010. If you look at people with a university degree versus people that left school at 16 or left school at 18, the gap doubled between 1980 and 2010, a huge increase. 2010 to 2019, it kind of moved sideways. Inequality was very high, but wasn't really changing. From 2020 onwards, we've seen an incredible reduction of the gap. And this is heavily related to working from home. So think about 2020, 2021. If you have to work in a professional job, you can do it remotely. So you don't face infection risk, you don't have to wear a mask, you don't have to commute. from our survey data, people say it's worth about an 8% pay increase. They say, we asked them, would you rather go in 5 days a week or work from home 2 or 3 days a week? And how much would that be worth salary? And the typical number is about 8%. So professionals, graduates, high earners, since the pandemic have had work from home, either hybrid or fully remote, that's worth something like 8%. If you look instead at non-grads, the types of people that do face-to-face jobs, their conditions have not been great. There's infection risk, masking, social distancing. And what we've seen since 2020 is the labor supply of non-grads has pulled back. There's several million workers that are missing, and that's pushed their wages up. The labor supply for graduates has been pretty strong, and their wages have actually risen, but by less than inflation. So just to put numbers on it, in America, from 2020 to 2023, the gap between graduates and non-grads has closed by about 10%. And that's almost exactly the valuation people put on work from home. So the big picture is, over the last 2 years, the fact that I and probably most people listening can work from home makes our jobs more pleasant. We want to work, we're more willing to work. That's pushed down graduate wages. People who can't work from home, a lot of them are retired earlier on. That's pushed their wages up, and that's reduced inequality. Now, looking out, predicting for the next 10, 20 years, I think you could see more of the same. So in a very, kind of unpredicted, unusual way, it could easily be that work from home as it rises actually reduces inequality, which is one of the biggest challenges of our time. And in fact, the other thing that is likely to do the same thing is the rise of AI, things like ChatGPT, OpenAI, that, they also appear to be making graduate well-paid jobs, they're kind of replacing some of them. So I think work from home and AI collectively are going to reduce inequality looking out for the next 10 years, which as an economist and thinking, as all of us living in society, thinking about the political system we want, I think is good. Very high levels of inequality have led to populists and, extreme politics in a way that I think is very damaging and unpleasant. And as inequality falls back down again, I think societies will feel more connected, more unified, and I think that's all good. It's really interesting to think what the limit of teleworking is. The other day, someone was telling me about a company they're investing in that's taking a job I would have thought would be impossible to telework and converting into telework. So that was street cleaning. So think of a street cleaner. My idea of a street cleaner, they're going along, they have a brush or a machine, they're cleaning the streets, they're picking up litter, they're emptying bins, garbage bins. You think, how could that be remote? Like, how could that possibly be remote? And they said, you know what, we're developing robots that street clean, but these robots aren't perfect. What happens is they'll be going along and they'll discover, there's a piece of construction or someone's dropped something or there's, a person that's fallen down and the robots stop and they don't know what to do. And they said, what we've set up is a control center where one human is in charge of 6 or 7 robots. And that human might have been previously a street cleaner that was out in the street. Now, rather than cleaning, one street at a time, they're controlling 6 or 7 robots, but they're working remotely. So even a job that you think will be impossible to do remote, in some places is done remote. And a friend of mine, John Cochrane, who's a famous economist at Stanford, was saying he went to visit the dentist, and he sent me a photo on text of a picture of in the local dentist. It's very close to where I live. There's a big sign saying we're sorry, we can't get any receptionists, they're sick. So we have a remote receptionist. And there was no one at the desk. And there was a camera and there's a screen and there was a woman there and she said, yeah, I'm remote. And he asked her where she was and she said she was in Wyoming, which is thousands of miles away. And she checked him in and he went to see the dentist and he said it was a bit odd, but it was totally fine. And that's another thing. You'd have thought receptionist has to physically be there. So I think if you look 10 to 20 years out, you could see rather than 55% of jobs being fully in person, that could shrink. And this, right now, 45% of jobs are either partly or fully remote. So that's the minority, and 55% are in person. That's the majority. Those shares could easily swap around. So I wouldn't be surprised to see 20 years from now, 2/3 of jobs are partly or totally remote, and 1/3 of jobs are in person. Another fascinating impact of work from home is on the structure of cities and real estate. So I don't want to make anyone hungry, but it's been called the donut effect. It's like the American donut, which is round with a hole, not the British one, which is, filled. So the donut effect talks about how in cities across America, and in fact, we've recently got data from MasterCard, so we see right across Europe, including us looking at data for Berlin, for Paris, for Zurich, for London, people have left the center of cities and moved out to the suburbs. So why is that? Well, I think if you're a manager and professional, before the pandemic, you needed to go into work and back every day. And you thought, well, I used to do this. I did this for 20 years when I lived in London. It's a long commute and I want to live near work. And so people try to live near in the center. Now in 2023, we know actually we probably only go into work 2-3 days a week. So you think I can live further away. I can put up for a long commute if I'm only doing that twice a week. And certainly I can put up with it if I get a home office by moving out to the suburbs. And what we've seen in America is about 1 million people leave city centers of big cities and mostly move out to the suburbs of the same cities. So think of New York, they've left central Manhattan, they've gone, roundabout to Queens or the Bronx. In San Francisco, they've gone to North Bay, East Bay, South. In London, they've gone out to the suburbs. In Zurich, they've gone out, etc. And this has had many, many effects. So the first effect is pushed up property prices in the suburbs and relatively held them down in city centers, rents included. So if you own an apartment like my neighbor did in central San Francisco, he happened to have bought an apartment there before the pandemic. He's unfortunately done very badly. So the price of that has not kept up with inflation. So he's lost money. If you'd bought an apartment out in the suburbs, these things have gone up in some cases by 100%. So you've made a huge amount of money. If you're renting, of course, the story is similar. If you're renting in the suburbs, you've seen your rent go up. If you're in city centers, it's compared to inflation, it hasn't actually kept up on average. So on real estate, it's had a huge impact, moving mainly people out to the suburbs of big cities. Then what about commercial offices? And that's been more mixed. So what we've seen is for commercial offices, most companies have kept their offices in city centers because they're generally the view with hybrid. You want people coming in on 2-3 days a week, and you want something nice, something central, something people to come to. So those big offices are mostly still there in city centers. Smaller offices, ones that are less nice, have often been got rid of and have been converted into residential. So if you're what I call a European office, so 3-4 rooms and maybe a bathroom, something that was built in 1900 or 1880 or 1930, a lot of those are actually starting to being converted back to living accommodation. If instead you're in one of those massive skyscrapers that was built in 1980 or 1990, it's hard to convert them. They're just too big. If you need many more bathrooms and bedrooms to have apartments in them. People don't want to have internal space. They like windows in their bathrooms and their bedrooms. So offices are mostly staying, but smaller ones are being converted. And then the final change is on retail. So retail in the city center is down and it's up in the suburbs. So I've talked to, Starbucks, Au Bon Pain, Panera Bread, a number of these firms. And what they say is sales in the city center is down, but sales in the suburbs is well up. So, me, you, everyone listening probably is often working from home. We want to go for lunch on a Friday. We're at home. We go to a local high street shopping mall. We get a Starbucks. We used to do that in the center of cities. And that's another factor quietening city centers down. So the big picture is, if you go from 1980 to about 2019, the centers of cities were doing better and better. So across Europe, across America, if you go back to 1980, city centers were had crime. They were not very expensive. They weren't seen as nice places to live. They got better and better and better, relatively more and more expensive. By 2019, city centers are really expensive. They're often the best property. That's partly reversed. That's 10, 15 years gone back. So we've had the rise of the city center from 1980 to 2019. And then there's been a bit of a decline. It's not terrible. It's not like they're industrial wastelands or anything, but it's maybe taking us back to 2005. Thinking about the impact of work from home on public finances, I want to separate out between national and local. And this is particularly important actually in America, less so in Europe. So I'll explain in America and then discuss Europe in a minute. So in America, at the national level, mostly when people go fully remote, they're just changing states. So I live in California in Silicon Valley. It's very, very expensive. Stanford University now has several hundred, if not thousands, of employees that are fully remote. Mostly they don't live around here. They live in, much cheaper places in America where you can buy better housing. Now that still means for the federal government, for the whole of America, that tax is still paid. It's not like these people are leaving the country. Now, there are some overseas fully remote workers, but Americans, every American that wants a job right now is pretty much able to find a job. So as many people as want to work can, and so tax revenue, federal tax revenue is great. The problems come from cities, city centers. So I think of London Breed in San Francisco or Eric Adams in New York. They do face bigger problems, and the reason for them is what they oversee and the taxes they raise are based on the center of these cities. So take San Francisco. What's defined as San Francisco and London Breed's area is not very big. So if you go to what's called East Bay or North Bay or come to where I live, you're no longer covered by London Breed. You're in a different part of, a different city, and your taxes for spending, for property taxes, for income taxes don't go to her, they go to somebody else. So if you're these American cities, the center of these cities have seen activity go down. They've seen tax revenue go down, but they still need to spend money. So, San Francisco still needs police, nurses, doctors, fire, etc. And so they're facing real trouble. To make this worse, public transit ridership is also way down. So if you think of, London Underground or New York Subway or the BART or the Muni in San Francisco, these on average have seen ridership drops of about 30%. It looks like they were down about 60, 70% in 2020. It's recovered, but it looks like it's permanently 30% down. And that's reduced their ticket revenue and created another budgetary issue. So I think the big picture is countries like Germany, Switzerland, UK, USA, are generally not affected by remote work. People have moved, but they're still at the country level, somewhere in the country paying taxes. What has happened is much smaller, fiscal units like cities or local authorities and city centers. They've lost people out to the suburbs. They often have public transit that are now losing money, and they're in real trouble. And in America, we saw in 2008, 2009, cities went bankrupt. And it may be that some cities, New York almost went bankrupt in the late 1970s. I don't think that's going to happen again, but it's going to generate a lot of tough times, union strikes, unhappiness that cities are cutting payroll, putting up taxes. So that's the biggest challenge, I think, is for cities, and particularly mass transit part of cities. For cities, the solution to this are likely to look a lot like the types of solutions the OECD and countries have tried to apply to firms. So I'll step back a minute. So economists have long said, look, when something is mobile, it can move. You often get what's called a race to the bottom. So take capital, companies and things, particularly intangible capital like patents and research labs that can be moved relatively easily. What we've seen over the last 40 years is tax rates across countries have gone down and down and down. So Ireland in the 80s said, we're only going to tax you, 15%. So lots of companies go to Ireland. Then the Netherlands says, we're only going to tax you 10%. They then go to the Netherlands. And then Ireland says, okay, we're going to meet it at 5%. And so across the world, corporate tax rates have been falling and falling and falling as a kind of race to the bottom. And it's not helpful, but if you're an individual country like Ireland, if you charge firms 30%, they all leave. If you charge them 10%, they all come in. So it's an incentive to cut. And it's called, race to the bottom or cutthroat tax competition. And that's problematic. That's not great. The solution to that has been cooperation. Like the OECD and the US Treasury have tried to get all of these countries together, say, look, let's all make an agreement. No one's going to set taxes below 15%. We're all going to agree, and that way we can all get fair taxes off companies. Now, work from home has kind of led to that issue a bit now for labor. It used to be if you worked in San Francisco, you had to live in San Francisco, and so your taxes would be paid to San Francisco. Now, if you're fully remote, you can work in San Francisco but live somewhere else, and your taxes can go to somewhere else. And maybe you visit occasionally, but you're not paying them much taxes. So I think what it probably needs is greater cooperation and coordination across states and across areas. So in America, it may mean that there's more federal tax and less local tax, and the federal government shares it out. Now in America, that's like, sacrilege. People will be rioting. They hate taxes. They hate the federal government. Many people do anyway. For Europe, I think it's a bit easier, and Europe tends to be, in Switzerland you have the cantons. So there are various places whereby it's going to be a challenge. But I think it's going to push more tax, more decision-making power to bigger levels, whereby you can make sure you tax everyone rather than very local units, because people can move away because they're working partly or fully remotely and avoid your tax level. Fully remote working enables people to work wherever they want around the world. So there's obviously an issue about rights. So if you're not working in the US, say you're working for a US company as a IT support or payments processing, let's say out in the Philippines, you're now covered by Philippines rights, and they may be, weaker than American rights. As an economist, I'd need to look on a case-by-case basis. I'm not sure. You kind of want people protected against discrimination. Obviously, you want them protected against exploitation. But I'm not sure what the correct level of rights is. Some European countries, I think, have too many regulations. There are other countries that have too little. It's a complicated situation, but it's certainly clear that employment is going to go to lower wage places, and lower wage places may often be lower wage and less regulated. There's also a move towards contracting and outsourcing. So people often confuse offshoring and outsourcing, but they're potentially quite different. So if I'm, Goliath National Bank, to make up a make-believe bank, I can either what's called offshore, so I can set up subsidiaries in the Philippines and hire people there, or I can outsource. I can go to a company like Odesk or ServiceNow and say, look, I want you to provide all my call center workers. I'll give you money, you provide the services. That's called outsourcing. Now, outsourcing enables them to go around the world, and they're no longer employees of Goliath National Bank, they're employees of a different company. Either way, you can see how jobs can move out of Europe, out of Switzerland, out of England, out of the US to places that have lighter labor regulations. That's an issue. That's already been true for manufacturing, to point this out. So manufacturing has been globalizing for 30, 40 years. One of the attractions of China is they have weaker regulations. One of the attractions of Vietnam is they have less unions, less regulations in Europe. So this is now this issue that has been in manufacturing for decades now moved to services. The other issue I just mentioned is kind of interesting. I saw a paper by a group at Berkeley showing that remote workers are also less likely to unionize and less likely to be active. So they had a research study whereby it was kind of a clever idea. They'd hired a number of workers in India, and some of them they'd randomly brought into the office, and some of them they'd randomly had working remotely, and they changed some conditions, and they wanted to see what the individuals did. And those in the office, the changes were they made them better and worse, and at the end of it they made everyone good, everyone was happy. But for the period of the experiment, some of the conditions got worse, and the people in the office would group together, go see the manager and complain. I mean, you can imagine, they get together, they'd walk into the manager's office and say, you just cut our salary by 5%, we're not happy, what are you going to do about it? Whereas it turns out the remote workers didn't activate, they didn't unionize, they didn't use their voice, and they tended to be more passive. Again, people have different views on whether they like or dislike unions and how much unionization you need, but it's certainly the case that when people are in person together, they're more likely to collectively work together, to push back. Whether they're remote, that's less likely to happen. In terms of country policies, I think the key things are provide the infrastructure and then get out the way. So you want to make sure that there's broadband, really great broadband, so people can work from home. You want to make sure the tax system is reasonable. There's a supply maybe of housing across the country, or at least you don't prevent it, and then move out the way. For firms, they're adopting hybrid massively because it makes them money. So there are countries like Portugal, Ireland, Germany, I think, are considering legislation to try and speed up work from home. My view is you don't really need that. Companies will do that anyway. Workers want to work from home, typically 2-3 days a week, because it's better for them. It's, most people don't want to work fully remotely. So to give you numbers, 70% of people want to come in at least one day a week. Only 30% want to be fully remote. And companies on the other side also want people to work typically 1-2 days a week because it makes it easier to hire people, reduces leaving, it increases productivity, it saves them a bit of space, it supports diversity. So in both sides, both employees and companies, they both want some work from home. So the key thing is the government makes it possible by providing good broadband, by providing infrastructure, and then gets out the way and lets the free market work. I think the biggest long-run challenges because of remote work, at least the ones I can see. So I should say everything is changing so fast and this is so new. There's probably things we won't see from now. But the most obvious one I think is the impact on local budgets and public transit. So just take London, because I know London, for example, is where I grew up. London Underground is going to see something like 20 to 30% permanently less ridership because commuters aren't going in and out to work, every day. That reduces revenue. That puts a big strain. And then what are they going to do? Are they going to cut services? Well, then that means less people ride and you can get into a vicious cycle. They've probably asked, London Council, the government of London, to subsidize them. But London Council has seen a lot of high-paid workers moved out to the suburbs and it's seen its tax revenue go down. And they may ask, the UK government to subsidize it. It gets complicated. So one thing I think is the fiscal impact. The other thing I worry about a bit in the long run, particularly around fully remote, is the possibility to polarize people. So there's really interesting work by some of my colleagues, Matt Genskow, Jesse Shapiro and others, showing that if you look at where people get their views from, so if I'm a Democrat, say, if you look at when I talk to family, to friends, or read online, I tend to also get pretty Democrat views. Or if I'm a Republican, I get Republican views. So people's families tend to hold very similar political positions to them. Their friends are self-selected. Their media tends to be self-selected. So if you want individuals having a more diverse set of views, the best place to get it in the data turns out to be the workplace. So if I'm a Republican, when I go to work, I'm going to have to sit and talk to Democrats over lunch, over coffee, and I'm going to become more moderate. If I'm a Democrat, the reverse. Now, if you let people work fully remotely, they can become pretty extreme. And so that's another concern, is the more remote people are, the more you can get real extremists on the left and the right, fueling populism, extremism, all kinds of, unpleasant things. And my own view is populism and extremism is partly what led to Brexit, partly what led to the rise of Trump. Both things I think, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Obrador in Mexico, things that I think are kind of problematic actually, and don't generate good policies and are not good for society. These kind of politics that are aimed at splitting people apart rather than bringing people together. And that's another issue I have a little bit remote, particularly fully remote. I think fully remote raises this risk and raises a longer run risk of just more extremism in politics around Europe and the US. So remote work, we know it's changed work. For sure, it's working from home. Turns out it looks like it's also changing leisure time. So I'll give you an example I've been working on, which is kind of interesting and funny, which is with a student at Stanford, we've used satellite data and AI to identify every golf course across America. So golf courses are really easy for AI to identify. There are 18 strips of green and it's pretty, and there's 3,500 we picked up. We then match that with data from GPS from cars. So if your car has like one of those screens like Teslas do that gives a map, you have GPS. And even if you don't, you're probably not aware, but that signal is being sent back to the manufacturer and they're selling that data on. So anyone that has a mobility thing, like I have a BMW, it has a little map in it, that means my data is being sold on. So we have all of that plus cell phone data. And we use that to look at trips to golf courses. And we define them as you see the GPS signal goes into the course or the car park and is there for more than 2 hours and then comes back out again. And what you see is golf course visits in 2022 are about 50% above 2019. So there's been a boom in playing golf. When you look at where that's come from, it turns out none of that's on Saturday or Sunday and hardly any on Friday. So those are already days that are really popular. They're popular in 2022 as in 2019 and the levels are very similar. What's happened has been a surge in playing golf on Monday to Thursday, particularly in the afternoons. So when we interviewed golf courses and players, they said, look, If you go to 2019, golf courses are pretty empty on Wednesday afternoon. People are at work, not many people are able to play golf. Now with the rise of work from home, there's a lot of individuals that are working from home. They want to play golf. They basically take 2 hours, 3 hours out on a Wednesday afternoon, and they probably go work more on Wednesday evening or on the weekend. And we've seen an enormous increase in golf playing throughout the week. Now, if you look at it, it's very even throughout the week, very even throughout the day. Now, you could be cynical and say that's terrible, but we know, to step back, it doesn't seem to be damaging individuals' performance. So the economies of Europe and the US have done pretty well. Firms are reporting good numbers. People are playing golf in the day, but they seem to be making up for it in evenings and weekends. The positive side of this is this gets around peak loading. So if you're I don't play golf, but if you play golf, you like to play tennis, go skiing, go to the gym, go to the salon, go to the hairdressers, go shopping, any types of activities that in 2019 were all crushed into the weekend. Work from home is allowing that to spread out. And I think that's very positive. So you have all these facilities, shops, hairdressers, salons, gyms, tennis courts that used to be only used for 20% of the week on the weekends and maybe in the evenings, are now going to get more evenly used throughout the week. So it's also changing leisure. Work and leisure are starting to merge, but I think it's mostly in a way that's helpful. To be positive on that, people like to work from home. When you survey them, they want to work from home hybrid, even though that's involving this merging of work from leisure. So it's not that we're forcing people to, work in the evenings and weekends. They're choosing to do that because they're choosing to, go play tennis or pick their kids up from school. And so that shows how work from home is not only affecting work, but it's also impacting leisure.